Thank you. Just to start off, I'm sorry that Jeremy couldn't be here today. He had something come up at the last minute, so he asked me to fill in for him. I certainly won't be able to live up to the standard that Jeremy could, but I'll do my best to walk you through this presentation. So just to set the stage a little bit, Jeremy is the point person for environmental impacts for the Soybean Innovation Labs projects. So he and 4 of his graduate students, including me, do some work in this area. We visited northern Ghana this past January and did some work there with 2 partners on the ground, Catholic Relief Services and the Savannah Agricultural Research Institute, or SARI for short. So just to kind of put this in perspective and give you an idea of where we fit into this whole thing, we're environmental engineers. So for the Soybean Innovation Lab as a whole, the goal is along the lines of improving agricultural productivity for smallholder farmers, as we've been discussing throughout the day. And that connects to a number of different sectors, a number of different dimensions associated with development. For us, we focus primarily on the bottom of this slide, looking at the connections between intensification, the environment, and also pulling in some of the effects on human health. And that's where I'll really be focusing today during this talk. So we'll begin by looking at kind of a broad overview of the interactions, the intersection between agriculture and intensification of agriculture, health, and the environment. And then we'll move into kind of just, I'll give you an introduction into some of the work we've begun in northern Ghana, looking at these connections. So beginning with this broad overview, agricultural intensification, of course, has a number of different pieces to it. One of those pieces typically involves increased use of fertilizers and pesticides. On the one hand, this can be very beneficial for smallholder farmers. These things can improve yields, potentially improve health and nutritional security, potentially. But at the same time, they also open up potential exposure pathways for these types of things. So there are a number of connections that have been made between fertilizers, for example, nitrates in drinking water connected to things like blue baby syndrome, some more hypothetical, theoretical connections with birth defects and a number of cancers. At the same time, for pesticides, while a number of the more dangerous or hazardous pesticides have been banned in higher income countries or are highly regulated in high income countries, they might still be widely circulated, widely used in lower income countries, and they have a number of health effects associated with them as well. At the same time, there can be a number of complicating factors that might also play a role in disease burden and health of people in these contexts. For example, issues related to water and sanitation. For example, contaminated drinking water with fecal matter that can be associated with open defecation or unsafe sanitation systems can lead to increased risk of pathogen exposure. And that in turn can lead to diarrheal diseases, environmental enteric dysfunction, and that can impair immune function and human nutrient absorption within the body. So thinking about this from the perspective of a farmer and his or her family, if we're trying to improve nutrition and health for these people, by increasing inputs, by increasing fertilizers and pesticides, on the one hand, we are increasing yields potentially, which will help in terms of income, nutrition, and health, on the one hand. On the other hand, there's also the potential to undercut these benefits through these negative health impacts, these connections that I just talked about on the last slide, on the previous slide. And we also have these complicating factors related to pathogens. So the question for us and the kind of work we're trying to do is looking at what we can do with the Soybean Innovation Lab, its partners and farmers on the ground, to really achieve these sustained production goals and improve nutrition goals while accounting for these additional factors. So that's going to move us into what we've begun to do in northern Ghana, looking at these connections. So to begin, we took a survey that was done previously by the gender equity piece of the Soybean Innovation Lab, this WEAI Plus survey. which was conducted in northern Ghana. And we identified 2 districts that were included in that survey that we were going to focus for our work. So the reason we picked these 2 districts, in a number of cases they were similar, and in a number of different areas they were similar, but they had a few key differences that we wanted to focus on. The major difference involves primary drinking water source. So in Karaga district, which is on your left, the primary drinking water source in that district typically consists of boreholes. So these are protected groundwater sources, not typically at risk for as much contamination from agricultural chemicals or from pathogen exposure. Whereas in Talone district on the right, their primary drinking water sources are typically surface waters, so things like lakes and ponds, and constructed dams, which are at much greater risk of contamination. At the same time, these 2 districts were relatively similar in their levels of sanitation. Unfortunately, there's a lot of open defecation in these 2 places. They're also similar in terms of the responses that the survey got related to health. The other major difference relates to drinking water treatment, which matches up pretty well with the types of sources that people are using. In Talone district, where there's greater surface water use, there's also a greater level of household drinking water treatment. So we took these data and kind of used them to think about, on the one hand, Karaga district representing protected water sources, on the other hand, Talone district representing unprotected water sources. You can see some examples on the bottom of the slide, a borehole on the left and a constructed dam on the right, an earthen dam. So what we did in January when we visited Ghana, we conducted a field sampling campaign with our 2 partners, CRS and SARI, on the ground. The first component of this campaign involved a household survey, which we modified from the previous survey that had been done. For us, we focused mostly on pesticide and fertilizer use, how farmers are using manure, if they're producing manure, if their livestock are producing manure. And also, we took a look at water and sanitation practices and also impacts on child health. The other major piece of this campaign involved sampling of household drinking water and also community water sources. So we took samples, did some field analyses that we could do on site, and then transported those samples to the soil chemistry lab at SARI, where we did some additional biological and chemical testing. Now, unfortunately, we're just kind of at the beginning of analyzing these results and thinking about what we're finding, and we've got some ongoing work to try to clarify some of the uncertainties that exist. But what I'll do right now is just walk you through a few of the basic results from some of the surveys. So what we're seeing here, this can look a little bit complicated at the beginning, but basically all it's showing is the relative number of people responding that they're using a certain type of agricultural input, and then the types of crops where they're using those inputs. So for example, the large blue bar on top represents that quite a few people responded that they're using pesticides and that they're using those pesticides on maize crops. So most people in both districts reported using pesticides, so we've got a lot of people using pesticides. In Talone district, it was about the same for fertilizer use, about the same percentage of respondents. In Karaga, significantly lower, although still almost half. So the basic takeaway here is that quite a few people are using pesticides. Ooh, that didn't work. Sorry. I also prepared this on a Mac, so there must be, this is really going to be difficult. Let's see what the next, yeah, that's a problem. Okay, so the way this used to look, we had fertilizers up at the top and pesticides on the bottom. The basic takeaway from the fertilizer pie charts was that most people are using NPK fertilizers. Some people also use ammonia and ammonium sulfate. For pesticides, it's a much wider range of chemicals being used. The ones that were supposed to be starred are classified as moderately hazardous by the WHO. So these are insecticides and herbicides, some of which are already phased out in higher income countries due to their toxicity and environmental persistence. It's it's a shame you can't see how big the pie slices are. Some of them are like a quarter of the people or about. But anyway, the point is that a lot of people are using pesticides, and some of those pesticides are classified as being decently hazardous. So this is an issue that we need to be thinking about. And while we were there, we also identified a number of potential exposure pathways through which those health effects could be caused if people are coming into contact with these chemicals. So these can range from things like in-house, in-home storage of fertilizers and pesticides, just coming into direct contact during when you're storing them in your home. Also through application on the fields when the farmer's applying pesticides, they might inhale some of what they're spraying. They might, again, come into direct contact with it on their skin. Additional pathways include things like agricultural runoff, as has been touched on by some of the other presenters already. Now, as I said, we're just kind of getting into this analysis, so I can't really give you any definitive findings in terms of which pathways are the most significant, so the relative risks that we're seeing. And some of the greatest uncertainties surround this issue of drinking water contamination, which we really wanted to focus on. A major reason for that is that we went in January, which was a dry season, not a growing season, so not many crops were being grown, not many chemicals were being applied, if any, when we were there. So this snapshot in time was very potentially unrepresentative of what would be occurring throughout the year. So to try to kind of clarify that a little bit, we've got some ongoing work occurring as we speak with our partners on the ground. So they're taking monthly samples. CRS is taking monthly samples from some of the water sources that we identified using the initial set of laboratory analyses. So they're continuing to take samples, and then they're moving those or transporting those samples to SARI, where they're going to continue performing biological and chemical analyses on those samples. And we're hoping that through this ongoing work, we can start to identify some seasonal trends. Think about how chemical application and how different seasonalities are affecting levels of contamination in different places. And then we can start to try to make recommendations as far as where the greatest risks are and how we might be able to reduce those risks to protect environmental health and human health in these communities. So we have some kind of rudimentary survey responses on that. Basically, like how much fertilizers people are buying and whether they're using all of it and what crops they're applying those fertilizers to. So it's not perfect, but we think we'll be able to get at some sort of quantitative idea of that, yes.